Now we're going to add IK handles, which are kind of like virtual muscles or tendons between certain bones. And we're also going to add a control rig. So to add IK handles, we're going to find that under the skeleton, under the rigging menu set, under skeleton. And I'm going to go to create IK handle. Let's go to the options here. And if I reset this tool, I want to just turn on this sticky. This means that it's going to try to snap to the joints themselves. So turn on sticky is the one thing I would change in the IK handle tool. And what I'm going to do, and this will allow me to then control the leg as one unit. That's what the IK allows us to do. So whether they're arms or legs, we can create these kind of connections for this whole limb, and then we can use that IK handle to control the movements of the leg. So I'm going to also make sure here that I have, these are my like rigging selection options. I'm going to turn off select the mesh itself. So I'm going to turn that off and we're just going to be able to select the joints. And so I'm going to zoom in here. And the first thing I'm going to do is click on this top left shoulder. And then I'm going to click on the ankle or the foot joint. And now what you'll see if I press 4, we'll see a green connection between that kind of shoulder joint and then the foot joint. And if I go to move this IK handle, now remember we rotate joints, but we can move these IKs. Now you'll see that when I move this IK handle up or down, it's changing the kind of it's repositioning the joints and rotating that knee. Now, something to know about IK handles, you'll see this little white indicator here. This is its pole vector, and the pole vector is the direction at which the IK handle is pointing. Because my joint, my kind of leg joints prioritize a knee, the knee is kind of in front of the foot and a little bit in front also of the hip joint, it automatically will create that line in the back and know to put the pole vector in the front. But if you have a joint chain that's stacked one on top of the next, we might have to reposition that pole vector. So like I said with IKs, IKs are something that you translate. So I'm going to go ahead and zero those out. And I did not like when I did that. So let me undo and let's go back and create the IK handle again. And actually, this brings me to the next kind of thing that we're going to talk about here is in order to get this IK handle back to its kind of starting position, it's really good to have a control rig to make all of those adjustments. These are really like random values in space, hard to remember them to get this leg back to its kind of neutral position. But first I'm going to go around and I'm going to put all the IK handles in. So I have the left front foot, and let me click and click the right front leg, and then we'll go to the back and we'll do click and make sure it's selecting this joint and then this bottom joint. That's the back left, and then IK tool handle, IK tool again, click and click. Okay, so now my outliner, I have my 4 IK handles. I'm going to go in and name this left front IK, right front IK. This is left back IK and right back IK. Okay, so now there's a couple different ways that we can set up our control rig. The first one the first thing I'm gonna do is I'll create those controllers for the IK handles themselves. And we'd use controllers, we use curves in order to create controllers. So the control for these feet, and actually might as well start with the front left since that's where I've started with my IKs here. I'm just going to, actually what I can do is grab that. I can say snap to point here and try to snap it right to, let me turn off the visibility for the geometry and see if I can't snap that. Yeah, I'll snap that control right to the center of that joint there, which is where the end of that IK is located. Now, what I can do to mirror it across, and let's also make sure that these IKs are, that looks good. This one. This seems a little bit like it's rotated that foot. So let's see, let's go back to this IK. I'm going to do this one more time. I'm going to zero this out. I want to make sure, let me get rid of this IK handle for a moment, and let me go back to my root joint. Let's select all in the hierarchy, and let's make sure that these values here are zeroed out. Okay, now that's back to, that's the correct position. So let's go back, let's add that left IK one more time. IK. So just be sure before you start adding IKs that your joints themselves, the whole joint hierarchy, right? Select the hierarchy that selects everything in the, let's go to the select tool, select all in hierarchy, and that will select all of the joints in that joint hierarchy. Make sure that their rotate values are 0. So we're back to that neutral bind pose. Now what I'm going to do for this, and I think when I had that original IK, left IK handle and manipulated and then deleted it, it kept those joints in that weird rotation. So one more time, we'll go to create IK handle and we'll click an IK between these two. And now I can see that if I go from my side view here, everything's lined up really nicely and everything's symmetrical. So then let's go ahead and rename this left front IK. And then I'm just going to drag and I'm going to drop this here so I have it back in this order. Okay, so now I have my controller here. And so now with snap to point and my joint, my geometry visibility turned off, I'm going to move this to the, let's move it to this joint here. And let's also then get it flat on the floor. Let's move its position in the Y down. Make sure I'm selecting my control, my curve here. So now that's flat on the ground. And then the last thing that I'm going to do is duplicate this across. So I'm going to go ahead and press D. And I'm going to move the pivot to this center line here. And then this is the same trick we did with the eyes, but I'm going to then say duplicate. And then in this scale, I'm going to say -1. And now it's positioned. Now I have one these at the exact same position on the other side. The last thing I'm going to do here is for each one of these, I'm going to maybe first I'll say modify center pivot, and then I'll hit D again. And I want to position this pivot right at the center of this joint. Let me turn off snap to grid and turn back on snap to point. And let's put that pivot right at that center of that joint. And then we'll hit D again. Finally, the last thing I want to do is say modify freeze transformations. What this does now is this controller is in its kind of neutral position. This is its center of origin now. And so whenever we want to go back to, we want the IK to go back to this position, well, we can just put 0 in the translate for that particular control. Let's do the same thing on this side now. I'm going to select, I'm going to say modify center pivot just to pop it back close to the center. And then with snap to point turned on, I'm going to hit D and I'm going to move that up to this joint here and hit D again. Then with this circle selected, I'm going to say modify freeze transformations, and that's going to 0 out all of those values just like we'd like it. Okay, so now I'm going to double click here and I'm going to relabel these. I'm going to say left, front, IK, control. And the same for this. I'm going to right underscore front, IK, control. Okay, so now we'll do the same for the back. Okay, so I'm going to take this and I'm just going to hit Command D just to move it to the back here. So I've moved it to the back, and let's also be sure that, let's just go ahead and say modify center pivot. That'll pop it to the floor. I'm going to say, let's snap to the grid and let's make sure that it's flat on the grid, and it is. And then for this back leg, I might move it up a little bit. Let's turn off snap to grid at this point, and let's just move it up a little bit so it's actually kind of circling that whole foot. And then I'm going to hit, then I'm going to move it to the center. So I'm going to hit D to move that pivot, turn on snap to grid, and move it to the center of the grid, hit D again. And then when I go to duplicate this, I can just give that duplicated back controller a -1 value in the Z, and now it's going to pop it there. So now modify, just like we did for the front center pivot, and here on the left side, and let's make sure I kind of maintain the right ordering, right? This is left front, right front, and then this one's going to be left back. So let's go ahead and label it. Let's say left back IK control. And then this one's going to be right back IK control. Okay. So now I have my IKs and I have the controls, and nothing's been done with them to have them actually manipulate the IKs, but we'll get to that. So the last thing I want to do now is here, hit D again. One thing I wanted, oh yeah, let's do that first. Here, hit D again, snap to point, and let's move that pivot right there, and hit D, and then this one as well. Select this curve, uh, modify center pivot just to pop it to the center, D to move it manually, and there. And now for these back two, and just for good measure, we'll do it for all four of them. We'll say freeze transformations. Now all of them will have their own like local zero values, which is great. And also that scale value is no longer an issue with a -1 or something weird like that. Okay. So now, in order to parent these, we're not going to, or in order to get them to affect the IKs, we're going to do what's called a parent constraint. And we have these constraints here. And so for each one, I'm going to select, I believe I select the control first, and then I select the IK handle. And I'm going to say constraint, I'm going to give it a parent constraint. And what that does now is I have a constraint on that IK. So this controller is actually the thing that I turn off snap to point, is the thing that I'm moving in order to manipulate that leg. So I have this controller here. And then remember, if I want to get it back to the neutral position, I just put in a 0 value here for that controller in the translate channels. Let's do the same for these. I'm going to select this right front control, and I'm going to command or control select that right front IK, and then I'm going to say constrain parent. And we're going to do that for each one of these, left back to the left back, parent constraint, right back to the right back, parent constraint. All right, so now we have those controllers are all set up. Now the next thing I'm going to do is generate some controls for some of the other joints and some of the other bones. So I'm going to turn this back on. I'm going to rotate this around 90 degrees, and not in the Y. I'm going to rotate it in the Z. Okay, and then let's move this up, and let's make it a bit bigger. Let's give a control to let's give a control to the neck next. Okay, so let's kind of make this around where the neck will be. Let's also move it so that it's, now we can also do it this way. We can dive into the joint hierarchy and find that neck joint, and we can say NURBS circle 1, which is the neck control. I'll relabel that in a moment. And that neck joint, I can say modify match transformations, match translation, and that's going to pop that circle right where that joint is. And so now I have this control. I can also then maybe, just with the circle selected, move this down a bit, and then hit D and pop this back up with snap to point, turn off the geometry, and let's position that right there in D. Now let's rename this neck control. And let's also make sure that we modify freeze transformations on this. Now here again, we will say neck control to this neck joint. So rather than to the IK, we can actually parent these controllers directly to the joints in the joint hierarchy. So I'll say constrain, parent constraint. And now this neck control, and we will use this, we are not going to translate this. We translate the IKs to move all of these joints, but we're still going to rotate. We're going to rotate this joint in order to change the position of that neck joint. And then again, when I want to bring this back, I can go ahead and zero out these values here. So let's go ahead and create another joint. I'm going to rotate it in the Z 90 degrees. And this time I'm going to make a control for the shoulders. I'm going to control the shoulders by controlling this spine 3. And the other thing I'm going to quickly do, turn off snap to point. Let's look at this circle for a moment. To make this controller, I'm going to actually go back to my modeling toolkit here. And for this curve, I'm going to turn on open close. And that way I can kind of open this curve. And this is how I want to, I'm going to rotate this around, this controller. Kind of opened it in a weird way. So I'm just going to kind of position it like that. And this way I can kind of just give an outline to where I want this. Let's position it maybe here. Let's actually just snap to grid, because we can snap it to the center easily like that. And maybe with this, I'll go in and go to my control vertices, and maybe I'll just kind of turn off this snap to grid for this time. And maybe I'll just kind of describe where these shoulders are. Go to my tool settings and say world and scale these in a little bit. So I'm just going to give some general shape to this controller so I know what it's affecting. I can kind of guess what it's affecting more easily if the shape of it is kind of outlining the shape of the body. Okay, so it's just a visual cue. I'm going to go back to object mode here. And with this controller now, it's kind of rotated at a strange angle. So I might just do a freeze transformations on this just to pop that joint or pop that pivot back to the world position. And now I'm going to move this back. Let's position it this way, let's say maybe about there. So we know we can go to our side view also might be helpful. I'm going to frame this up and let's kind of frame it with this joint here. And then of course here, let's turn off our visibility for our geometry, hit D and snap to point, and let's position this right at this joint. Good, done. Now, let's rename it here. This is going to be shoulder control. And I'm also going to make sure that I have modify freeze transformations on that. Now with the shoulder, like I did for the neck, I'm going to find spine 3 here. So shoulder control to spine 3, that was a command and click. And let's go back to our rigging menu set and constrain parent constraint. All right, now when the shoulder control rotates, I want that neck control to go with it. The neck control is stable, so the shoulders aren't affecting the neck right now. Let's turn on the geometry so we can see how this is looking. Not great. So I'm going to undo that. Let's undo. Let's change this to 0 here. Let's turn back on our visibility for our geometry. All right, I need this neck control to be parented to the shoulders. So I'm going to right click on the neck, or sorry, middle mouse button the neck, and then drop it into the shoulders. Now, when I rotate the shoulders, that neck will come with it. Now I have the same thing with these legs, right? The IK handles at the bottom are fixed and they are not moving with the rig. So I'm going to also go in and zero this out. And then I'm going to take my two IK controls, my right front and left front, and I'm going to drop those also under the shoulder. So now when the shoulder rotates, those IK handles can kind of come with it. So the whole leg comes with it. And then I can go and manipulate the IK handle to make sure I'm not snapping the point here. I can change and manipulate the rig. There's still some weird skin weight stuff that I'm going to want to fix, but right now I can still continue to work on the rig and build out the rig, and then I can go in and fine tune all the paint skin weights as I'd like to. So now remember what I can do is select, I'll go to select the hierarchy here and I will translate and rotate values set to 0, and that will zero everything out in the whole rig, which is super nice. So let's create one more control, and that's going to be maybe the back in order to control the back leg. So again, I'm going to do that same little thing I just did, that same trick. Go to my modeling toolkit, open and close this curve. I'm going to then rotate this around so it's just outlining where that back is. Doesn't have to be perfect. And now I'm going to move this up. I'm going to scale it as well. And I'm going to position it in the back here. So going to my side view, I can kind of see generally where I want to position this. Maybe somewhere like that. Let's go back to our perspective and take a look at it. And then, I can change, maybe go right click over this, go to my control vertices, select these two, scale them in maybe these as well. This is just for like appearance, just so I'm able to say, okay, there's the back of the rig. All right. And so now I'm going to go to object mode here. I'm going to say D to move the pivot. Let's turn off the visibility. Let's snap to point. Let's move this pivot right there to that back joint. Hit D again so it's settled, and then modify freeze transformations on that curve. Turn the visibility back on. Now for this, I'm going to call this back control. And I'm going to now parent constrain this to go under back join here. So this back control to back joint, and go back to my rigging menu set, pair and constrain them. Now for the back IK handles, these two back IKs, I'm going to middle mouse and drop them onto that back control. So now they will also be they will also kind of move with this back joint. Okay, so I have all of those parent constraints here. I have them all labeled. Now the last one I'm going to put in the scene is my root control. So I'm going to kind of I'm going to outline the Rhino by, turn off snap to point, by just generating a curve that kind of encapsulates the model at the base. And then let's go ahead for the root control and hit D to move the pivot of this root control. I think I accidentally pressed S instead of key, so let me undo that. I saw the red line up here and then a red line here, so I accidentally pressed S. Instead, I want to hit D, and now I want to snap to grid here, and I'm going to move the pivot to the center, to the origin, and that way I can always put it back at the origin. Now here I'm going to call this root control. Okay, and then shoulder and back, shift select both of those, or command select both the right middle mouse button over them, middle mouse button, and drop them into root control. And the root control, I can now parent constrain to the root joint. So I'm going to parent constrain that. And now this root control is going to move the whole rig. Okay. And then inside these controls are where we'll find our shoulder control, and then we'll have our neck control, our front and back IKs, and everything else is in this joint hierarchy. So that's the basic rig. Now there's a couple more controllers that we will want to add. But we can still go in and things like the ears, for example, I can just rotate and key the joints, but I'll probably want to add more controllers to this rig. But this is the basic rig and a kind of basic setup for you. There's one other kind of control that I want to show you, and it comes back to these IKs here, that these IKs have a pole vector here, which is the kind of the direction that the IK, or in this case, that middle joint, that knee, the direction it's pointing. So what we can do is we can have a control that actually adjusts that. So let's go in and create one more circle. And this time I'm going to rotate it again in the 90 degrees. And I'm going to snap this to my knee. Let's get into the knee, left shoulder, this knee. So I'm going to have this circle and this knee. I'm going to say modify, match translation. That will pop it there. And then I'm going to move it forward, just the circle, not the knee too. I'm going to move this forward. I'm going to right click over it, and I'm going to shift and select these control vertices and give it a kind of diamond shape. Scale this down. That looks pretty good. Right click again and go back to object mode. Scale this down a little bit further, and then make sure that I am hitting D and turn off the visibility for the geometry. Let's snap to point. Let's put this pivot right at the joint of that knee and hit D again. Okay, so that's ready to go. I'm going to do the same on the other side. I'm just going to duplicate this, and then I'm going to, with snap to point turned on, position it here at this joint to make sure it's in the center. It looks good. And then let's duplicate it again. Let's move it, and let's make sure, since we did left, right, I'm going to do it the same here. So let's move this right there and then duplicate it again, and we'll move this joint to this side. All right, so now I have these pole vector constraints. Let me label them. This is going to be left, front, pole vector, PV control. Let's do this one is going to be right, front, pole vector control. And then this one is going to be left, back, pole vector control. And the same, right, back, pole vector control. Okay, so now I can select this curve, and I can go back and select this IK again, left front IK and the left front control. Select the curve first, then the IK, and let's do a pole vector constraint. And now what that does with this controller is it allows me to move, turn off snap to point here, position that knee. So where that knee is positioned is now controlled by this controller, which is super helpful. The other thing that I think I forgot to do though was zero out was to freeze the transform. So let's go back. Let's undo that. Make sure that this left front, let's undo till we get rid of that pull constraint. Let's just make sure we have our controllers selected, modify, freeze transformations for those controllers. Super important. Let's try that again. Left front pull vector control to the left front IK and pull vector constraint. Right front to the right front. Left back to the left back. Right back to the right back. Okay. And now we'll want to also position these controls. We'll want these under this shoulder control. And we'll also want them to follow where the pole, where this IK handle is. So for the pole vector, left front pole vector control, I'm going to drop that under the left front IK control. And the same thing for the right front. And then I'm going to do that also here. So the left back pole vector can drop under the IK. So it will also move with this, which is really helpful. So I can move these independent of each other, but also together. And the same thing with this. We're going to drop this here. Okay, so I think that that's kind of our final rig. There are other constraints that are really useful. I might put them in another video. Something like aim is a way that when you have like a a um like a human form or something with forward facing eyes, an aim constraint will allow the eyes to move together and aim at a particular location. I think it's aim. It's either aim or orient, but I believe it's aim. So there are other constraints here that are really helpful as you build out more complicated rigs. Now, again, I might want to add other controls here, but but for now, I think this rig's done. Actually, there's one other thing I want to do, or I already have done it previously, but one other thing I want to point out is that I had these eyes, right, that I made, but I parent constrained them to the bones that I put in my joint hierarchy. So when I built out my joint hierarchy, I added these bones. They're not going to rotate or do anything other than be locators for those the eyeballs themselves, so that when I go to rotate, let's hit 6 here. When I go to rotate this, let's say the neck joint with the head and everything that goes with it, those eyes will follow it. But they're not actually parented and they're not inside the joint hierarchy. So they're still able to be separate objects outside of it. So there's last couple things I would do. We have these controllers here. I'm going to drop these to the top of my outliner here. And then I have all my geometry and also I'm going to have all my geometry. And then, I pulled the neck control out, which is not what I wanted to do. I wanted to select this root control and I want to pull this to the top. Just kind of reorganize some of this. The rest of this, if you're making a rig, I'll also take these root controls, say select all in the hierarchy of those controllers, and I'll add them here and I'll say controllers. So I have a display layer of our controllers. Okay, and now I can also turn off select joints here, and now I can only click on the controllers. I can't click on anything else in the rig. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of these things and I'm going to create a group for them. And this is, if you're working in industry, I've seen that people do this where this is like, do not touch. This is for an animator to know this is what we're going to be working on. And then in here, don't touch anything in here. So again, this root control is the thing that's going to like move the entire rig. And in the next video, I'm going to do a couple more things to this rig, and then I think we'll call it complete.